Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Terrific. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for making your way here this evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and a real pleasure to be in conversation with Diane Coyle, whose work I have been reading and following for many, many years now. So a real privilege to be sitting here and in conversation with you. I thought the best way to kick this evening off would be for you to set out your stall, tell us about the book, and then we can dive into a conversation.
Well, this is the second book I've written about economic measurement. And when you tell somebody this is your area of special interest at a party, they will slowly edge away from you. That's very interesting. But the one that came out 10 years ago was a history of GDP, which is a sort of everyday acronym that's in the newspaper, and politicians talk about it all the time. And it turns out to have an interesting history. The main message for me being that it isn't a thing. It's made up. It's an idea. And so the notion people have that there is some definitive understanding of what the economy is incorrect. And in the 10 years since, I've been doing a lot of research about economic measurement linked to my interest in the digital economy, which again I've been studying for a very long time. And I gradually came to realize, as I looked more into the official statistics, that the way that we lead our lives now is invisible in the measures that are available to the government and businesses. If you think about what's happened since 2007, when Steve Jobs launched the iPhone at that iconic press conference, we all have these devices all the time. We're always linked to a network, always on. Businesses have changed their business models. There are platform models. There are all kinds of new websites through which we do so much of our daily activity, shopping, travel, booking, banking, and so on. And this information is not collected in the data that go into constructing GDP. So the first point of this book, The Measure of Progress, is that even on its own terms, GDP is missing what's been happening to the economy in the past decade or so. And even if you could capture that better, it clearly doesn't include a lot of the things that people have been criticizing GDP for many years now. It doesn't include the devaluation of the natural environment and questions about sustainability. It doesn't include the work that people do in the home that's not paid, and that's changing a lot with digital, because things that we used to pay for, we now do for ourselves. We might put our holiday together online ourselves rather than go to a travel agent and pay their commission. And so that boundary between the paid economy, which GDP is supposed to measure, and the household economy, which does things of enormous value, you know, the caring and so on, is very fluid. And so GDP by itself, even if it were a perfect measure of the digital economy, isn't capturing what we think of as economic progress.
Terrific. So did you say you wrote the brief and affectionate history 10 years ago?
10 years ago.
10 years ago, interesting. So I recently wrote a book on growth, and that book of yours was a sort of really, really important for me in thinking about the history of where this GDP measure came from. So one thing I'm interested in is, over the 10 years, and you sort of hinted at it a little there, is how your thinking has changed. You know, if you were to revisit that sort of brief guide to GDP, what's happened over the last 10 years that has made you think differently or put new emphasis on the sort of observations you were making in that book?
I'm trashing the place already. I think it's that the economy has changed so much more.
Yeah.
All of those digital phenomena are so much more pervasive. The impact that the economic activity is having on the environment is so much more visible. So I think it's just the passage of time makes it more important.
Yeah. On the digital side of things, I mean, so what is it exactly, just to go into a little more detail, that makes the GDP measure so unfit for purpose given the way in which the economy has changed. I mean, not only over the last 10 years, but over the last sort of century or so.
Well, you know those children's games where they have to sort shapes into the right shaped holes?
Yeah.
I feel we're at a time where the structure of the economy has changed so much because of the technology that we've got a set of shapes and the holes are completely different, so you can't match them up. There's just a complete mismatch in many ways. So I can give you lots of answers to that question. We use these services like search and social media that we don't pay for in monetary terms. GDP is good at measuring money, but it doesn't know what to do with these free services, or how to treat the fact that we're giving our attention and time and companies are making money out of it. So there's just no agreement among economists and statisticians about what you do with that, and so they're not doing anything with it. Or think about the value of data. All these data-driven companies are making a fortune. They're all talking about how important it is. It's only just this year that the definitions that go into GDP have said, we ought to count the investments companies are making in data, because that hasn't been done before. The kinds of production models that involve global value chains where a multinational will outsource all of its manufacture to somewhere else, they're not captured in trade statistics. Apple famously doesn't make iPhones. It does the design. It has about 2,000 components that come from multiple countries and all get sent to Foxconn factories to be assembled and then re-exported back to the United States. That model is common in electronics, in auto manufacture, in pharmaceuticals, and that means that the trade statistics that we see, the bilateral figures that obsess Donald Trump, don't reflect where the value is going and where it's being created. So there are just all kinds of examples like that where the models that are being used aren't captured in these figures that get used by governments to interpret what they should do and by businesses all the time to make their decisions.
Yeah, and there's a sense in which, the way in which I think about GDP is that, it was crafted in a world where you really could, the things that you valued from an economic point of view, you really could see and touch and drop on your feet. You could count stuff going into inputs into production and outputs from production. It was designed in a very, very different economic world.
You can drop your iPhone on your feet.
You can drop your iPhone on your feet. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can't drop your Google on your feet, I suppose. I suppose the question then is, and you hinted at it a little there, is the so what? Why does this matter? And I've got my own reasons for why this matters tremendously. But I'm interested to know why does what sounds at a distance like a sort of, kind of technical quibbles about how we measure some sort of economic variable, why does that matter? Why is it so important? Why is it so significant?
Well, I'll give you my answer if you give me yours as well.
Okay.
Well, the hint I gave was that governments and businesses make decisions on the basis of these figures. We in this country have a chancellor who says growth is what it's all about. Growth is being measured by the change in GDP over time, and the policy decisions that she will take in the next budget will be guided by how much she thinks it's going to increase economic growth. And so that's true everywhere. Countries obsess about their rankings in terms of GDP. Is their GDP bigger than everybody else's? So it affects decisions that consequently affect everybody's lives. Businesses also use these figures to forecast what their markets might be, and so it just affects real-world decisions. Beyond that, it determines how we think about the world. I mean, the very idea of the economy only came into existence around the same time as GDP. It was just people did things that were part of life. And so this idea that there was a separate domain called the economy that needed special treatment was linked to the figures themselves. And so the figures actually affect the reality. They're not real items, but they affect how our world changes because of decisions. It's very self-fulfilling because of decisions that people make.
But it's not, I mean, what you are getting at in the book is, although GDP is a sort of signature measure, really what's the kind of deeper complaint that you have is about it's about statistics, economic statistics more generally. Not just GDP, but also, for instance, productivity statistics, and it's the whole sort of suite of things that policymakers and politicians use to understand what's going on in the economy. Is that right? It's broader than just
Yes.
GDP alone. Yeah.
And businesses have no idea what economists mean by productivity.
No.
So they can understand if you talk about their profits or even their value added, but they don't know what we mean by productivity. And then things like how do you classify jobs or industrial sectors? Those are artifacts of the way that the system was set up in the post-war years. So you can have a lot of different types of painter, but all of the jobs in digital and software get lumped into one or two categories. So we don't actually have what would be really useful information for something like growing these important sectors of the economy. So what's your reason?
For why GDP is important? I mean, I have a slightly... GDP sits at the center of our kind of common lives. It's the thing that, as we're both saying, drives politicians and policymakers. But there's also a sense in which what has happened in the 21st century and the beginning of the 21st is that what started out as a sort of narrow technical measure of the amount of economic activity that's taking place in a market became a sort of less a kind of technical measure of economic activity and more a sort of moral measure of what mattered. That the fact that GDP sat for so long at the center of our common lives meant that what we choose to count became what counted, and that it sort of took on, because of its sort of policy making position, even more importance than it was originally intended to. It begins in the 1940s during World War II, just as a way of telling how big the economy is. The British government have no idea how much they can dedicate to the war effort of the economy and how much they need to keep behind for civilian needs. There's no measure of how large the economy is. And so in steps John Maynard Keynes and Simon Kuznets in the US to come up with the first, serious, reliable measure of how large the economy is. And it's for a sort of very narrow technical purpose. Fast forward 80 years, and the role of GDP, not only in the economy but in society more generally, is just so much greater. So for me, it's the way in which it's taken on this almost kind of moral significance as well.
Well, a good example of that is the move of women into paid employment in the 1960s and 70s, which ought to be an individual decision for the family concerned. Is it better for you? Do you prefer to go and work for money or work in the home? And both are economically valuable activities. But that social trend led to a boost to GDP growth and productivity figures through that period, which we think of as a golden age of productivity, but quite a lot of it was that social change, which we then valorized through counting the money measure, but not the household activity measure.
And there is in the beginning this debate about whether or not GDP ought to just be this very narrow technical measure of economic activity, or it ought to be broadened in various ways to be a moral measure of what matters. Debates about we ought not to include spending on the military, or we ought not to include advertising expenditure because those are bad things, and we ought to include some measure of the state of the environment and so on because those are good things. And is that something? Can you say a little about that history and how you think about that in the context of today?
Well, somebody who's often called the father of GDP is Simon Kuznets,
Yes.
and he was very clear that it could not be a measure of economic welfare. The way it took shape was determined exactly, as you said, by wartime needs, and that's the reason ultimately that government spending is included in GDP, even though we don't attach prices to public services. And things that are sometimes called regrettables, having to pay for police or pay for defence, get included in GDP as well. So there's a long debate about if it's a narrow measure, should you exclude all the things that don't actually have prices attached to them, just have the market economy? But the minute we start talking about GDP in real terms, as economists would put it, you're kind of automatically turning it into a measure of progress in some broader sense than the technical one that you're talking about.
I think I might just pause here for the moment. I know the original pitch that was that we would talk for 45, 50 minutes and then open up to questions, but I'd quite like to, as we talk, just hear questions and reflections as we go along. So I wonder just now, before moving on to some, and what I think would be really helpful is if you say who you are and where you're from, just to put the question in context. That would be terrific.
Thanks for the opportunity. My name's Tim Carter. I'm a member here. I'm an entrepreneur in tech and an ex-lawyer, so not an economist, but I was wondering as you were talking whether this is, especially your point about what's morally in or out, is this a question of a level of zoom, i.e. the more you zoom out and measure activity, which would include all of the impacts of human behaviour, that would include environmental effects, etc., and the more you zoom in, you can exclude more and more, and you can segregate responsibility, and that level of zoom that you choose is probably a political choice rather than a moral one, was a question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I guess I think of it more as a spectrum, and you can start with a really narrow, these are the commercially produced activities that people pay money for, and that's actually quite straightforward to count, so that's the narrowest measure we might do. And then we would add in government services, which gives us something like our GDP measure, and then you might move further and further towards things that are explicitly capturing a broader sense of economic welfare or well-being or progress, and so you could put your depletion of nature in there. So there is certainly a lot of thought going into what's the right place on that spectrum for what kinds of policy discussions.
Yes, the lady on the right-hand side here in the colourful shirt. Just yes, exactly.
Shirini Lahi. I do scenarios, so foresight is my field. I was fascinated, I've read half your book, but not quite finished it, by the concept of time tax. Will you deal with that now or later? But I think the whole concept of time, that's something I think we don't talk about enough, but including that in this new, brave new world we live in that is so intangible, I found a fascinating concept. Thank you.
Am I allowed to talk about it?
You
now?
are absolutely
Okay.
allowed to talk about it, yes.
I think time is a really interesting perspective to bring to this debate, because we've all got 24 hours a day. We've got to spend them. We'll spend some of it asleep and doing personal care and so on, but that's the fixed budget that everybody has to spend, and you can't carry it over. So one way to think about, is the economy progressing, is how much money plus enjoyment do we get out of how we spend our time. So you could think about doing a complete time budget of the economy. And you might think about some jobs are horrible quality, so we'll downweight those and upweight other things. But it's an accounting framework, so it's a good rival to GDP, which is a money accounting framework. You can think about time as contributing to productivity as well. A lot of the things that technology does to increase productivity rely on reducing the amount of time. So steamships cross the Atlantic faster than sailing ships. The assembly line made it faster to manufacture a car than the previous factory system. So a lot of productivity gains are also having time is a useful way to think about that. And then there are other things that we do in the economy where spending more time and high quality time is actually the measure of progress. So perhaps we should distinguish activities between, do we want to speed them up, or do we want to slow them down and make them better? And so if you want to get a quick haircut, you're going to go to Big Jim's Trims around the corner and pay £10 and he'll do it really quickly, or you want the experience of a salon in Mayfair and pay £110 and enjoy the head massage and the pleasure and the chat. So you can think about that kind of distinction as well. The time tax is, I think, one reason why, although the economy might look good in GDP terms, people don't feel good because of it, because companies are using technology to take our time away, to stop us unsubscribing from things, to stop us getting through from expensive human customer service representatives, and shifting that burden onto us. Another example are those automatic teller machines that all the stores have now. Stores used to have people who would put your groceries in your bag for you, and then they went and you bagged your own groceries. Now they've taken away the human checkout person, so you check your own groceries out and you put them in the bag. That's great for stores' productivity measures as they're conventionally defined, but the work's still being done. It's just being done by shoppers for free. And so the time lens, I think, gives you a really interesting perspective in different ways on whether things are getting better or not.
Can I just make an observation? Because one of the other criticisms that, so my particular interest is in technology and AI, and one of the observations that's made about GDP as a measure of progress in that setting is that GDP it doesn't do a very good job of capturing changes in quality. So this phone today probably costs roughly what it would have cost 10 years ago, but in so many different dimensions. This is better quality, better camera, better resolution, more storage and so on. It sounds like from what you're describing about time, that's almost like a sort of negative dimension of quality that we're not capturing, that something has happened to the way in which we interact with other people, products and services and so on, that's not been captured in this measure. Is that right? Is that?
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Do you want to come back and
If you don't mind, I've also read your book on the future of work.
Yes.
And if you link work to the time tax, if somebody has one job that they work in for, say, 5 or 6 years, they've got a steady income, and yet somebody might earn the same amount of money over 6 years in a gig economy. That time is every time they have to find a job, that's also non-productive to the economy. Who actually looks at that statistic or includes that in any GDP measure? That's my question.
Well, I think this is also very just to respond to that. I mean, one of the I think the problems with the discussion that lots of people have about the impact of technology on work is that it focuses a lot on the number of jobs. Are there going to be enough jobs for people to do? Are robots going to take everyone's jobs? But actually, in exactly the way you're describing, often what technology does, and particularly at the moment, is it doesn't really affect the overall number of jobs. There aren't large pools of unemployed people due to technological change, but so the number of jobs isn't changing, but the nature of those jobs certainly is. The quality of those jobs certainly is. And I often point to exactly the sorts of parts of the world of work that you're talking about, whether it's the platform workers that you're describing, or other parts of the labour market that have now been enabled by technology. It's a sort of frustration that I have, and I think it's one that sort of runs through Diane's work, that economists aren't often very good at using the kind of traditional statistical toolkit at picking up on these other dimensions. If it's got a price, that's great. If it's got a quantity, that's great. We know how to sort of measure that effectively. But these other dimensions, which are slightly fluffier and slightly woollier and slightly more difficult to measure, we don't do as good a job of picking them up. I think there was some question here and then question at the front as well.
Hello, my name's Alec. I'm a psychiatrist from just kind of a bit further up the road, St Pancras.
Say that again, sorry?
A bit further up the road at St Pancras Hospital,
yeah. Psychiatrist, did you say?
Psychiatrist, yeah.
Okay.
So I was wondering, in terms of thinking about putting things like environmental measures into GDP, why would we do that and not just have a separate measure looking at.
So I love that question,
yeah.
but I want to get on to the what do we do about it once we finish this batch of questions. So I'm going to come back to that question.
Put a
We'll
pin in
pause
it.
your question.
Pause your question. Great question.
Great.
Not going to forget
I
it.
look forward to hearing it.
Question at the front here.
Thank you. My name's Rich. I work in international development and I'm a member of the Conduit. Dan, I'm sure you answered this in your book about the history of GDP, but I'm interested to, if either of you could speak a bit about how what was a very, very narrow measurement that came out of the war economy has evolved into something that is at the very heart of the entire, pretty much maybe bar China and Bhutan, global economy. And yeah, the entire capitalist system is anchored around this measure. Keir Starmer can't get on the stage without talking about growth. I'm interested to know how it evolved from being a measure during World War II, and I presume being used as some sort of score during the Cold War between the US and the communist world. And then I'm also interested whether the evolution from there is tied to something like neoliberalism, because while it is a narrow measure and has all these flaws, if you had that bent, it's almost a perfect measure of calculating progress. So yeah, I'm interested to know what the story is from where we went from a narrow measure to the core of everything, really.
Well, you started to answer that by talking about the Cold War. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, very few countries had any statistics like GDP. And so through the United Nations, the standard was set, and all countries that were members of the United Nations are supposed to do the same statistics. It got turbocharged by the Cold War because there was this contest between JFK and Khrushchev about whose economy was the strongest. And so the imperative then became to grow the economy, not just think about the level of GDP. And it's through a United Nations process that I think 4 or 5 times now the definitions have been revised, they've been made a little bit more complicated, new things have been brought in. The area where I think you could say financialization or neoliberalism, or whatever you want to call it, has come in most is through the definition of the financial sector. And there's a component that goes into GDP and increases it called financial intermediation services indirectly measured. And that means a measure between the bid and ask prices that financial traders use. So it's a measure of risk taking. And that got added into GDP in time for the biggest contribution from financial services to UK GDP to be in the quarter before the financial crisis hit, because they were taking a lot of risks. Adam Smith thought banking added nothing to the economy. It wasn't counted very much in the early days of GDP. Over time, the size of the sector has increased, so it's now about 6, 7, 8% of GDP. I think that's a false indicator of its importance to the economy. And given that the risks the financial sector takes actually had a very adverse effect on the economy, maybe we should go back to Adam Smith and take it out.
The thing I'd add about the Cold War, which I think is exactly right, is it was going from hot wars to cold wars. Though all the traditional metrics of who was winning the war, territory won and lost, soldiers killed, weapons destroyed, they weren't available, and so exactly as Diane's saying, the kind of the relative growth rates became a kind of proxy for who was winning this war. In part, I think because there was a view that if the Cold War was to turn into a hot war, whoever happened to have the larger economy would be able to fund the larger military and would triumph. But it was also, of course, and this goes to your point, I think, about neoliberalism as well, it was an intellectual battle of ideas between two very different ways of organizing economic affairs. You had capitalism in the United States, central planning in the Soviet Union. It was a sort of kind of whose economy was growing faster became a kind of proxy for which system was winning. And of course, what was unsettling in the beginning of the Cold War to the Americans was that some of those early statistics suggested that the Soviets were winning. And so it's sort of growthmanship relentlessly pursuing these increases in GDP just as the 20th century unfolded became incredibly important.
The Soviet bloc used a measure called net material product, which they took from Adam Smith and via Karl Marx. So they didn't count services. It was only stuff that got measured. And so the CIA had this whole business of taking the figures that they published on net material product and translating it into GDP terms. And well into the 70s, they thought that the Russians were growing faster.
Yeah. Was another question? Yes, please, yeah. If you just wait for the mic and then it will be picked up on the, yeah.
Apologies. Thanks both. Matt Oddy, I work in Climate Tech Incubator in London.
Yes.
Compute power, how far off a world do you think we are where if we're just simply looking at sort of international comparative power, that is a reasonable answer to the metric we should be considering?
A reasonable answer to?
As in a comparative metric as to sort of international power. As per GDP, it sounds like the original appearance of was driven to assess.
I think that would be a poor metric, partly because the technology is changing quickly enough that people in tech, as I'm sure you know, are talking about small models that just don't need that much compute power. So that's shifting quite quickly. We might get on, I hope, to what would be a better metric to compare ourselves to other countries. So again, pause that thought.
So let's turn to what we do about it. So the story that you tell in the book and the story that you set out tonight is that the GDP measure is not fit for purpose for a variety of reasons. How should we respond? What should we be doing to improve our measure of progress?
Well, I wouldn't throw away GDP.
Yes.
Useful information for monetary and fiscal policy, but let's try to measure better, get data on some of the phenomena that characterize the economy now. That's challenging because a lot of the data is held by private companies. The way that government agencies collect data is crumbling. They have always done it through surveys. They ask people. The response rates to those surveys are going down dramatically. Their budgets are being squeezed. Donald Trump is sacking the people who lead them, so the American statistical system on which a lot of people rely is now unreliable. So the basics are we've got to figure out some ways of collecting data about all the digital things that go on and getting the companies to go along with it and provide, as a public good, some information about what they do. They ought to think about it as being in their own interest as well, because if you think there's a techlash, or a backlash against AI taking jobs, part of the reason for that is that we don't have any data on what good things AI is doing because all the data is held inside the big companies. So there's a big challenge about getting access to data, modernizing the way it's put together because the systems are quite old-fashioned. I'm not sure at the moment how you get from the statistical agencies that we have to a better way to do it, but I think it's feasible. So let's make GDP better is the first part. And then let's think about other ways. And, we're going back to some of the questions we paused now. I think time use surveys, both at home and at work, they're carried out sporadically by some countries. We would get a lot of insight if we did those more regularly. They're online things now. It would be a way to spend 10 minutes of an evening filling out a time use survey. It would be quite entertaining, better than scrolling through social media. So let's start to collect that. But the other way to think about it is to think about what does an economy have? What resources does it have that helps it grow sustainably over the long term? We want our kids and grandchildren to be able to enjoy at least as high a standard of living as we have. That's not been happening for the past generation. So how do we measure that sustainable progress, looking across all the things that matter? So the kinds of things that go into GDP matter, the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, the bridges, the tube systems, the factories and buildings, all of that matters. The human capital, in this lovely term we economists have for it, people, how skilled are they? How healthy are they? We do have some measures of human capital. They tend to focus on educational qualifications and pay. They don't include health. And I think one of the lessons of the pandemic and an aging population is that the quality of health of your population matters too, so we can improve that. But also, two other things. One is natural capital, the resources that we get from nature. And some things are included. If it's a plantation of trees and they're cut down and sold, then we're accounting for that. If it's something like the biodiversity of a meadow or soil quality, we're ignoring that. And that has real repercussions. I was at a presentation recently of a paper by a Yale economist about bats in a Midwest state in the United States, which are succumbing to white fungus, and so 80% of the bat population has been wiped out. That means the insects are not being eaten. That means the crop yields are down. That means the local taxes are down, and the rates that they have to pay on municipal bonds have gone up. And so there's a large financial cost from not paying attention to the health of your bat population. Multiply that many times over. The resources that nature gives us to have an economy are immense. We're not even measuring physical degradation, like the size of the bat colony. Still less are we thinking about, well, what value do we assign to that? So one of our current research projects is to think about, if we want to put that on the same footing as GDP, how do we convert it into a monetary measure?
Yeah.
Bit controversial. A lot of people who care about nature really don't want to think about it in money terms.
Yes.
But if you put a money value of 0 on it, it doesn't affect any policy decisions.
So is your view here that something like natural capital, the reason we ought to measure it is because it's valuable as an end to economic activity? Or is your view that we ought to value it as an end in itself, that there is something valuable? It's not simply that the bat population, are important for, in the end, crop yields, but also there's something valuable about having a sort of healthy bat population. How do you think about, because those are two very different reasons to,
So I completely recognise the intrinsic value.
Yeah.
I mean, bats are great. Have you seen the video online of the bats turned upside down so they look like goths in a nightclub? If you haven't, it's worth looking at.
Yeah.
So intrinsic value, I'm not trying to measure.
No.
I'm trying to inject concern for nature into everyday economic decision making.
Okay.
By Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer and all the others.
So here's my kind of challenge, which is, and this is something that I sort of grapple with in my own writing on GDP and measurement, which is that. Sorry, just let me put this the right way. That these questions about what we value, if not economic growth and economic activity, so whether we value the state of the environment or the level of inequality in society or whether we value these things, the health of a population, whether we value these things and how much we ought to value them, there's huge disagreement about that. Those are not technical questions about mismeasurement, but they are sort of moral questions about what really matters in society. And it goes to, when your question to me about why is it I think GDP is so important. This idea that what we choose to count becomes what counts. So these questions about what we ought to measure and how much we ought to prioritize these things relative to one another, these are moral questions, not technical ones. I suppose the challenge, and it might sound like I'm shooting as economists, both of us in our feet by saying this, is, are economists and are statisticians and are civil servants working in treasuries and central government departments the best people for deciding what we value from a sort of moral point of view rather than a technical point of view?
So I completely agree that this is not just a technical issue. Measurement, like a lot of economic analysis, has a really important moral dimension that economists tend to ignore. And so you'll often get economists saying this is the right thing to do with such and such policy, without recognizing or acknowledging that saying it's the right thing to do does have this moral flavor to it. So it's certainly not just technical. But I'm very pragmatic about that. You're not going to get agreement about issues that have divided philosophers for centuries. That's not the aim. The aim is to get enough agreement to make things a bit better in the direction that a large number of people would agree with. For example, I think a large number of people would agree with the proposition that it's good for living standards to not go down over time. So something that edges us towards a better measure of sustainable economic activity is a good thing. So I think this is about what political scientists would call incompletely theorized agreements. You don't need to have an agreement about the fundamental underlying philosophies. You just have to agree about the next steps to do, the right direction to go in. So that's, as a practical matter, what I'm all about in working with statisticians and economists on this.
Okay. I'm conscious that often at the Conduit Club there's lots of people involved with the involved in work relating to the environment. I'm interested if there's anyone here tonight who works in those sectors who have reflections on what we've been talking about with respect to thinking about measuring the environment, valuing the environment.
I think they all think it's a good thing to value the environment.
Any other questions? Yes. And I saw you sheepishly retreat just there, so I have a few.
Hi, my name's Ned. I work in tech.
Okay.
We seem to agree that GDP is an imperfect measure of the health of an economy. There's value judgments in what to include, military spending, government spending, financial services. It takes time and money to put it together. It's not real time. And I was wondering if you think about a very large company, let's say like Amazon, who have an incredibly wide view of, let's say in the UK, transactions that are taking place, things that people are spending money on a day-to-day or even hour-to-hour basis, you could easily imagine a scenario where they could create a much more objective, real-time metric of the health of an economy, the private data, and that would be, I don't know, more accurate in some ways than GDP data, which is released on a monthly basis, certainly faster. I'm wondering, is that something that you think would be plausible? And if yes, is it a concern that they could have that advanced view versus sort of governments and public sector bodies, or not a concern?
So I certainly think we should be getting more private data. And there have been some small steps for private companies to provide data to the national agencies. Price data from scanners in the supermarkets is an example where there has been a lot of progress made. One issue is that a lot of the companies want to charge for the data rather than the old surveys were free. You know, you had to fill out a form saying what your sales were last time around. So there's a debate about how much does the government want to pay for access to that kind of data. I would argue that for many companies it ought to be part of their social license to operate, that this data they provide is collated. I mean, even Amazon, mighty as it is not the whole of the UK economy, so you'd pull together a lot of transactions data, credit card data, to get a better picture of that. There needs to be the political will to get these companies to do it. And when they're as large and powerful as the big tech companies, that's not been happening. We've got a legal basis in the UK to require them to hand over data to the Office of National Statistics. And as far as I know, it's not enforced. So it's a power thing, really. And as you say, they do have a lot of amazing insights about what we're all doing.
Any other questions? Question here from this gentleman now.
Hello, I'm Julian. I'm an investor and also the founder of an ecotourism company.
Okay.
So I've sort of been on the front line of some of the debates about biodiversity accounting, which is considered a dirty word among many conservationists. But it's
why is it considered a dirty word?
Because the idea of saying how much money is an elephant worth is fundamentally offensive.
Yes.
I'm not saying it's fundamentally offensive to me. I'm saying it's fundamentally offensive to many of the people in these debates, and that causes the debate not to happen, which is unfortunate. But I guess I wanted to hear from you about something that was proposed at one of the COPs, which was that certain countries that are responsible for conserving large amounts of biodiversity now, which are predominantly in the global south, were saying that if you want us to continue to do this, you need to pay us, because we also need to provide clean water and electricity and various other things for our populations. So if you don't pay us to conserve the rainforest or the savanna, then yes, we will build on it, and we will farm it, and we will mine it. And sort of what your views are on sort of accounting for those sorts of things.
Well, as a matter of moral accounting, it's hard to argue with that. As a matter of politics, it seems very unrealistic that that's going to happen unless there's some crisis. And you can think about tipping points in the Amazon as a crisis that might finally result in a recognition among the rich countries that they should make some payments for those. Payments for ecosystem services is the jargon term for it. At a time when very few governments in the West think they have any fiscal headroom, debt ratios to GDP are high and climbing, everybody wants to spend more money on defense and they're cutting their aid budget. This doesn't seem like a good political moment to land that argument in the international arenas, which is depressing, but I think realistic.
Is that something does that resonate with you? Do you agree with that?
I agree that it's going to be very difficult
Yes.
to get anybody to pay, because there's been a lot of pledges. There have been a number of pledges to pay, but there's very little money actually on the table.
Mm.
And the problem is, like, as we were talking about, if you want to think of it as like the time value of money, is that, meanwhile, development is ongoing. The rainforest is being clear cut because, those countries have their own priorities. And it's, and we can't really say that it's wrong to try to make your people's lives better.
The one example, the more optimistic example that people point to is Costa Rica and ecotourism, and having developed that source of revenue to fund some of the conservation that goes on there. So I guess the short-term answer is look for more opportunities like that.
Yes, question just here, yeah.
Thanks. My question, I'm Layla. I'm also a foresight practitioner, like my mum. My question is just kind of picking up on that kind of political will comment that you were making around, and I was curious about, you've sort of either said explicitly or hinted at the fact that, what we're looking at now doesn't really measure reality. If we were to measure reality, would that look worse? And is that kind of part of that political will about, like, if we were to, once you redraw the lines, it looks like we're worse off, and kind of politicians don't want to do that on their watch. And I'm also curious about, like, how could that shift? Like, I feel as somebody, I'm not an economist at all. I remember doing modules of it at uni, and there's just something about it that just confuses my brain. And I feel like a lot of the public, it feels like we hear these terms, but they sort of just feel a little bit abstract, or what you were talking about, that we are economically well off, but people don't feel it, that kind of time comment you were making. I'm curious about, like, is there any role for the public in convincing and to be able to help shift the dial as well in that kind of way?
Great questions. So I often ask myself the first one, if I could wave a magic wand and measure things perfectly, would we be better or worse off? I don't know. If you think about the nature aspect of it, we're worse off. We've got a debt to nature that we're going to have to pay back. But if you think about the digital stuff, or innovations in healthcare, or trivial things like the kind of smart materials that you can get your clothes made out of now, there are lots of ways in which we're better off. There was a program aired in, must have been 2000, called the 1900 House, where they sent a family to live as exactly as they would have if they were a Victorian household. And the thing that almost made the woman storm out and stop taking part in the programme was that Victorians didn't have shampoo, and she couldn't get her hair clean, and her hair felt terrible. So there are lots of everyday innovations that have made the quality of our lives much better over time.
I would have said penicillin would have probably been there rather than shampoo. But
I guess she didn't fall ill during
Yeah.
the filming.
Yeah.
And they might have made an exception and, given them an
I would
antibiotic.
hope so, yeah. Duty of care.
But on the other hand, there's also this question about, with digital tech in particular, but also things like energy prices, who is paying what prices? So the distribution of it really matters as well. And the kinds of price indices that get constructed that tell you what the inflation rate is don't really take account of distributional factors. So if you're on an income that's not been going up much, you're paying the time tax, the energy bills have gone up a lot, the food industry is making you ill by ultra-processing everything, the insurance industry won't pay out your claims, that you can certainly understand why a lot of people feel that they are not better off at the moment. Completely understandable.
And what about that second question about these numbers are abstract and sort of dry and alienating for ordinary people, and which is having written several chapters of a book on GDP, exactly as you said at the start, you say it's about GDP and eyes glaze over and look over the shoulder. Yeah, how do you kind of draw? And the question was asked. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting thought. I mean, people hear GDP up 0.2%, have no idea what it means. It's kind of incantation, isn't it? It's meaningless. It would be interesting to think about how would you include the public in that process of determining what gets measured. Statisticians are gentle, introverted people who do numbers and are not experienced in deliberative methods or engaging with the public. So it would be quite a big thing for them to do, but it's probably worth having a think about how to do it. I don't know how to do it.
I mean, this is a kind of big interest of mine. Is those questions that we were talking about before about what we ought to value and how much we ought to value them, and those being moral questions rather than technical questions. It feels like for me that's a great moment to involve citizens rather than statisticians, to sort of to ask the question of people, what do we value and how much do we value it? And one of my personal worries that I have is that everybody in the room here, and you made this observation before, attaches probably a high value to the environment, but that isn't a value that is necessarily shared by others. And you can look at sort of policy decisions that are taken to get today, for instance, the pursuit of net zero, which reflects a strong value attached to the environment that isn't, doesn't necessarily have the sort of legitimacy that comes through political discussion and dissent and disagreement about that sort of value. So for me, that's a really interesting moment for getting people involved in these conversations about what we ought to value and how much we ought to value it.
I suppose the moment of great political polarization might not be the time to start.
Yeah, or perhaps precisely the moment to start. Yeah. One question for you is when we get into these conversations about measurement and what we ought to measure, people often point to sort of Bhutan and sort of measures of gross national happiness, and I have a little experience of this from back when I worked in the these aren't new ideas. Back when I worked in policy in the policy unit in Number 10, the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, was very keen on alternative measures of well-being and lots of support for the ideas of Richard Layard and thinking about happiness and how you find other ways of measuring what it looks like to be a sort of flourishing society that is progressing. How do those ideas around happiness and well-being fit into your vision of how we ought to improve the way we measure progress?
I'm not a big fan of using well-being measures as the measure of progress, partly because they don't change much. The answer's always 6 or 7.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. It's because they're measured on a scale of 0 to 10, so they can't go to 11. So they're going to give you limited information. So for policy, I don't think they're very useful.
Mm-hmm.
It also ends up with economists who are interested in well-being going, well, I'll run this regression of well-being measures on all the things that I can think of, and it turns out that getting married is one of the things that most increases your well-being. Therefore, everybody must get married. So there's a kind of, I suppose, paternalism in a lot of the discourse about it that I don't like either. And then this recommendation that you treat well-being, which Richard Layard is associated with, that if you want to improve the life of the population, you give them cognitive behavioural therapy if they're depressed. I would rather give them a house that doesn't have mould and access to the GP and let the well-being take care of itself. So I'm much more focused on the sort of basic, what Amartya Sen would call basic capabilities that people have, and let them sort out their own well-being.
One question that I often find myself thinking about, and it relates to the question that was asked before about why did GDP take this sort of pole policy-making position in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century. I mean, one of the reasons, and we didn't mention it, was that there was a sort of feeling among particularly US political leaders that growth and the pursuit of more and more GDP was a kind of panacea that promised to benefit everyone in society. When President Kennedy spoke about a rising tide lifting all boats, I imagine in the back of his mind, a rising GDP lifts all boats. There was a sense that it sort of resolved a lot of the traditional political tensions and trade-offs, that if we could get more GDP and get a larger economy, then that was part of the attractiveness of it. And of course, what happened in practice was that a rising tide did not lift everyone's boats, and there was enormous inequality in how growing material prosperity was shared out. I'm interested in your thoughts on measures like GDP and inequality. When we think about GDP, people often talk about the environment, but inequality isn't often mentioned. How do you think about, GDP as a sort of measure of how large the pie is, and then inequality as a measure of how it's divided up? Does inequality have a role in these measures of progress? And if so, if not, why not? And if it does, how would it fit into that story?
It's really important.
Yeah.
And the measures that we use every day obviously don't take account of inequality. Those measures can be constructed, but it's a complicated data exercise using data on households to understand what the distribution is and what people are buying. But it can be done, and you can do the same for inflation measures as well. So I think economists just kind of ignored it for a long time because the rising tide in the 50s and 60s through at least the mid-70s had raised all boats. And my thesis advisor, Ben Friedman, wrote a book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, which was exactly about the point that if you don't have growth, political dissent becomes much more likely, polarization. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary to have a solid middle class and democratic harmony. And I think that's quite a persuasive case. Obviously, Thomas Piketty's book put inequality on the radar. Gabriel Zucman is doing fantastic work on the tax dodging by the very rich and understanding that better. So it's certainly a key issue. I guess it's just because of the statistical complexity, not become part of the whole GDP machine.
Yeah. Do we have time? Time for one question, and then I might put one final question to you. Yes, please, thank you.
Yeah, on the topic of inequality and measurement, it does seem to be a big thing at the moment, and I think when I have looked at the data, it looks like both for income and wealth inequality, it's been pretty flat since the early 2000s, so not getting worse. But it definitely seems like it's one of those big topics at the moment. Do you think that's a measurement problem, that there actually is widening inequality, specifically in the UK, or do you think it's a perception problem?
There was a big increase in inequality in the 1980s and into the 1990s. So although the level of inequality has flattened out, the scale of inequality is much greater than it used to be. down a lot after the Second World War. Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to be. People talk about it as the kind of thing that is driving a lot of discontent at the moment, and it may still be too high, but I'm just given what you're saying about the statistical complexity.
Yeah.
Is it that the wrong measures are being used, or why do you think this discrepancy?
I think the statistical issue is that we don't capture very top incomes and wealth. That's just not measured well. And so the plutocrats who buy the houses in Mayfair and send their kids to private school and take a helicopter to go to La Scala for the opera for the evening, we're just not measuring what they're doing, but people observe it. The other thing that I think is affecting that perception at the moment is inflation. And inflation is falling differently on people at different levels of income. Inflation is incredibly damaging politically. I grew up in this, I'm old, as you can tell. I grew up, I was a teenager in the 70s through the oil price shock and the commodity price shock at that time. And it imposed real hardship on families like mine whose incomes just were not keeping up with the rate of inflation. And so my mum had this cupboard where she would keep, if sugar was on sale, she'd buy 10 packets of sugar and put it in the cupboard. And so we called it her air raid shelter. It's a wartime habit that she passed down, and I still have a cupboard where I keep things when I buy them on special offer.
So I think I might just ask one more closing question. Sorry, I'm going to take my prerogative. And so I think the book is very clear on what sort of policymakers and governments and economists and statisticians need to do. I suppose one question, given where we are this evening, given the sorts of people in the room, is: are there any lessons for those in other types of organisation, for those in NGOs, working in charities, working outside of government, for thinking about what they measure and how they think about measurement? Are there any lessons that sort of carry over from the world of economists and statisticians to that different world?
Well, I think the lesson is the one that you set out, that what you measure turns out to be what matters. And so thinking about what it is your organisation measures and what really matters, and are they the same thing, seems to me a lesson that anybody can take. I mean, depending what kind of organisation it is, often there are, quotes, KPIs that are in the atmosphere and nobody's thought about them very much. But particularly with AI being introduced and applied to data of organisations, just thinking really carefully, because you're automating the use of that data and exaggerating the impacts it's going to have on decisions that get taken. So statisticians are really exciting. Measurement is really important, so think about it.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Diane. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you for the
to
great
the
questions.
Conduit Club for hosting. Diane, there's lots of books at the back, and I think we'll be free for further conversation and discussion. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.